In this video, we're going to get an introduction to Python relative to Fusion 360 API. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, I'm going to kick off a new series talking about Python API in Fusion 360. Now, I did a video talking about text commands and sort of writing your first script, and you didn't have to have any sort of prior knowledge in Python or coding or anything like that. This is going to be a little bit different. There were a couple comments, some requests for additional content on this. And when I looked around, there is some content that's available. The vast majority of it is fairly old. And a lot of it makes the sort of the assumption that you have some programming knowledge. Now, I think it's extremely important that you do have some programming knowledge. I am not a programmer. I have done some programming in VBA, Arduino, and Python, but I am by no means a programmer. So what I've been doing is I've been trying to figure out a way to convey this and sort of work through the process that I have when I'm trying to figure something out, whether it's coding or design or whatever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this small series. We're going to be building towards creating a script in Fusion 360. And the script that we're going to be building is going to create user parameters so we can use it as sort of a template generator. Now, since I'm currently releasing videos on plastic part design, that's going to be the focus. We're going to have things like a user parameter for draft, for wall thickness, for rib thickness, and so on. So that's going to be the goal, is to build that script. And we're going to talk about things like getting information on whether or not a user parameter exists. We're going to have things like user input and figure out how to handle that. And we're going to have to deal with things like whether or not the units are correct, whether or not the input is valid for using these types of functions. But before we ever get there, we need to sort of level set some expectations, and we need to make sure we're all on the same page. So we're going to get started in Python. We're going to do a basic introduction to Python on mainly the topics that are going to be important for us in Fusion 360 API. So when I say that, I want to talk about things like object models, object-oriented programming. We're going to figure out what an object is. We're going to talk about hierarchies and parent-child relationships. And mainly I'm going to be focusing on classes, which are going to be groups of data or attributes, as they're called, and functions or methods that we can use to do certain things. So that will all become clear. But I think at the very start, right now, what we need to do is make sure that we have some sort of programming environment. In my case, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. I have a link to the description. It's free to download. You could also use pretty much anything. You can code Python in Notepad in Windows, for example. But the benefits of having a dedicated development environment, so you see the term IDEs thrown around sometimes. The benefit to that is there are a lot of checks in place, things like formatting to change the color of certain texts, and it really will help the process. So I suggest that you use Visual Studio Code or something that you're comfortable with. I'm also going to put some links in the description to the Python page where you can download the development environment there. If you don't have anything installed, if you're working on a Mac, for example, you can use any number of different development environments. But I will say that there are some nuances that go along with each one. In some cases, you might have to install different libraries. And I'm not a programmer, so I'm not going to be able to walk you through that process. Visual Studio Code ends up getting installed on Windows machines from various programs, so you might already have it installed and just don't know it. So what we're going to do is work through Visual Studio Code. Again, use any editor you want. The actual code will be the same. You'll just have to work through the nuances of the user interface. So for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File, New File, and when I do that, the first thing I'm prompted with is to select a language, or it says to start typing if you already know what language you're using. But the benefit here is if we select a language, it'll help identify some of the nuances of that language. So for us, I'm going to scroll down until I find Python. I'm going to select Python, and now we're using the Python language. I have zoomed in quite a bit so that the text is a little bit bigger. I found by trying to watch Python videos online, if I'm using my phone or a device, that it's really hard to see the text. So after this first video, hopefully the text is big enough. It's going to be pretty large, so hopefully that helps. But we kind of need to get started with a few very basics. And because I've already been talking for 5 minutes and we haven't done anything, let's start by doing a quick example. So inside of Python, inside of any editor that you're using, the first thing that we want to do is we want to declare something. We want to give it a name and we want to give it a value. So I'm going to just use some basics for things like inputs, for dimensions, so we can kind of relate it to Fusion. So I'm just going to start typing input, and then I'm going to use either an underscore or an uppercase letter to sort of differentiate between the second word. We can't put a space in here, but you can use the underscore, or you can just capitalize the second one. We can't just use the word input because it's taken. You can see it's green. So I'm going to put input instruction. So as I start typing that, you can see there's a squiggly line underneath. Again, this is really where the development environment helps because it helps you identify problems right away. We're going to use space equals. We're telling it that this string of text that we created is equal to something. Now, strings are going to be groups of texts, and that's going to be important. So anytime we want to pass a name or some characters, and not necessarily just a number, we want to pass it as a string. And there are some things that we can do using code in Python specifically, but also some tricks that we can use with Fusion API to help us convert strings to numbers like floats or double precision numbers, or to booleans like true false. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start typing a string. And to do that in Python, you either need single quotes or double quotes. Both will work fine. And you'll notice as soon as you add one or the other, that it's going to automatically put the ending for you so you can just start typing. It makes it really quick. So our input instruction, please enter a value for the wheel's diameter. And you'll notice here that inside of this, I have an apostrophe S. Now, if I were not using double quotes, if I was using single quotes, that would automatically end the string. So this is why sometimes you want to use double quotes and sometimes single quotes will be fine. So I found if you're going to be doing a lot of text instruction, if you're going to be typing out a lot of things that might have an apostrophe in them, or if you're going to be using the foot and inch symbols, you need to be careful which one you choose. So I would recommend just using double quotes as a default if you think this is going to be a problem, or just be able to identify it if it is a problem. So now we have created our first variable. Now the variable is going to be something that we can control. We can either set it at a certain point in our project and that can remain that value for the entirety, or we can change it as we go on if we want to create a placeholder and then replace it with something later. But for this sort of introduction, we just want to understand that what we did was we created a variable and we inputted a string of text, of characters. Now I'm going to put input default. So we might use this for something like a default value, just in case we don't want, or just in case the user doesn't actually enter a value, we want to have something in place. So I'm going to say 5. Now, if I were to add, let's say, inch to this, that's not going to work because I and N are characters, so they automatically are a string. But if I just enter the number 5, it works as a numerical value. You'll notice it's purple, the strings are yellow, the equals are red, and the variables we created are white. This is actually going to be helpful when we get into Python API for Fusion 360, because when we create a variable and it's not used yet, it's going to be gray, and as soon as we use it, it'll turn white. So there's that visual cue, at least if you're using Visual Studio Code. So now we have these two variables we created. What are we going to do with them? Well, at this stage, what we're going to do is we're just going to print it out on screen. And the way that we do that in Visual Studio, and actually in any Python program, you're just going to simply use print. Now, as soon as we start typing print, I want to make note of a couple things here. First, we have a lot of different prints. When we look down at these, what I want you to focus on is going to be the icon to the left of it. Now, when we see this icon to the left of it, that purple cube, that is telling us that what we're doing is we're creating a mechanism or a function that can do something else for us. So this function that we're using is going to be important because now that's going to let us do something with the variables we created. So the way that functions work is we need to have brackets. And as soon as we do that, here's another reason why we want to make sure we're using a code editor or some sort of development environment that supports Python, because now we have this pop-up on the screen that tells you exactly what you need. You will note that there's a lot of stuff that might not instantly make sense, so let's talk about it a little bit. First, there is a lot of text in here. We can scroll up and down and get more information, but right now all we're really concerned about is this value. So the value has an asterisk next to it because it's required. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have this required value. You'll also notice that currently it's white, and this means this is the current thing we're entering. So for us, I'm going to start typing input instruction, and you'll notice that input instruction is actually in our list here. Now, we created this, but it exists inside of the programming language because we created it as a variable. It's sort of a placeholder, and it knows exactly what is stored in it. So this little icon here, if I wasn't on that, if I didn't select it, if I go back, you'll see that it's blue and has a little box inside of it. So our input default and input instruction are both there. So these can automatically populate. Another cool thing that we can do is as we start typing this, if our cursor is on it, we can just hit tab to accept it. Now you'll notice in our tooltip here, this is still white because we haven't added a comma. If we wanted to add more information, we could add a comma and then begin typing the next thing. But again, for print, it's not required. You'll also note that in this case, it gives you information. It says things like str. That stands for string. So if you see str as a shortcut, that's going to be a shortcut for a string of characters. So now that we have this, if I want to see how this program runs, what do I do? Well, the first thing I should do is save it. So we haven't saved it yet. So let's go ahead and either go to File and Save, or we can do Control and S, just like any other program. For me, what I want to do is I want to place it into a folder that I've dedicated to just playing around with Python. So I've called it the Python Sandbox. I'm going to go into this video testing, and I'm going to just say intro. You can see that I already have one in here. I misspelled Python. Now it's Python. But I'm just going to call this intro to Python, and I'm going to save it. Now, once it's saved, I'm going to hit this play button in the upper right-hand corner. It says run Python file. When I do that, the terminal automatically pops up at the bottom for me. Now, if you're working in a different development environment, that might be different for you. So just be sure you understand where to get the terminal or the console or wherever this is going to be displayed. And you'll notice that it tells me to please enter a value for the wheel's diameter, along with some other information about where things are stored and information about the script and so on. But the thing that's important to us right here is this please enter a value for the wheel's diameter. Now, it is important to note that when we open up a script that's created with Fusion 360, we're not going to be able to use this unless we include some additional libraries. And I'm not going to really worry too much about that because the way that we're going to progress through it, we're going to use things like message boxes that pop up in Fusion so that we know that it's working. Again, that's going to be unique to any of the different development environments that you choose to use. And again, since we're using Visual Studio Code, you might be using something else. We're not going to really worry too much about that. We're going to work through the process of debugging it by running it in Fusion. So now we've used print and we've used input instruction, so we printed out the string. We can repeat this process to use the input default. So we're going to print that as well. I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to play it. Now, if we take a look in our console again, you can see here that we've printed out 5 at the end, and because I've got the text size so huge, I have to move this around. You can see, please enter a value for the wheel's diameter and 5. So what happens if we wanted those to print on the same line? Well, we need to do what's called concatenation. We need to put them together. However, they're of 2 different types. So right now we've got input instruction that's a string, and input default, which is an actual number. It's a value. Now, these can be double precision, they can be integers, and so on. There are different sort of containers or types that we can associate them with. So if I just come up and I say plus, because again, Python is very literal, we can just try to add them together, and I say input default. If I try to run this and I say play, let's go ahead and take a look down here. We have a type error. So the type error is telling us that on line 4 in this module, this print instruction, input default, there's a type error because it can only concatenate strings to strings, not strings to integers. The int is an integer. So what this tells me is I need to do some conversion. I need to change one of these from an integer to a string, or I need to do something else to make this happen. Now, there are some functions that we can use that will allow us to do this, and we can either change the input default to an actual string. So if we save this and we run it, then it'll work fine. You can see that it inputs it here. I'm going to comment out the second line here because we don't need it. I'm going to use the £. So this works as long as this is a string. But if it's not a string, we can do some conversion using a function in Python called str. We need to use some brackets around what we want to convert. But now what we did is we told it that, hey, we want to convert whatever is in here, this variable, to a string. So once again, I'm going to save it and I'm going to play it. And now you can see we get this, please enter a value for the wheel's diameter 5. So these little things that we need to be aware of in this very basic example are things that we also need to be aware of when we're talking about inputs to the Fusion 360 API. There are different inputs that are going to require a very specific format for things like a number or for things like a string. So as we get through our future examples, we're going to pitch that to our future selves to deal with. But as we get to those examples, we are going to start to identify things like, incorrect variable type. Now, I will say that the error messages that we get out of the Fusion 360 API problems versus the ones that we get directly in here, they're going to be different. Now, these ones are very straightforward. I find them a little bit more helpful. The ones in Fusion 360 take a little bit of investigative work to make sure that we understand them, but it is still giving us the same type of information. So this was our basic example about creating a variable as a string, creating a variable as a number, an integer in this case, and printing those out, including concatenation. So concatenation is when we're putting two things together. And this is going to be important in Fusion 360 because sometimes we might want to do things like output a number and maybe the units, millimeters or inch or something like that. And we want to put them together, and the number and the units are going to be different variable types. One's going to be a number, one's going to be a string of characters. So let's go ahead and make sure that we save this. And now that we have this basic understanding of how to create some things and work with them in Python, it's important that we talk about some of the specifics that are important to Fusion 360 or just API in general. So everything that we've done so far has been pretty straightforward. We make a variable, we assign it to something. We say equals. We make a variable, we assign it a number, and then we print those out. And of course, we converted the number to a string, and we were able to concatenate them in that way. But again, pretty straightforward. But there are some topics that we absolutely have to get a grasp on. And I'm going to start just typing them in here. I'm going to use the # so it makes them as comments. And the first thing is that the Fusion API is going to be what's called object-oriented. So Fusion API is object-oriented. So what that means really is that we have what's called an object-oriented programming. Now, if you're searching, on YouTube or just online, and you're looking for resources to help you understand Python for API, maybe not Fusion, maybe you're using it for Blender, or maybe you're using it for something else, you're going to want to look for object-oriented programming. And essentially what this means is object-oriented programming is there is a hierarchy. So things have ownership within this structure. Now, what I mean by that is there is an object, and an example of an object is the extrude feature. Now, this is probably the one that you're going to come across in any of the resources in Fusion 360 API. It's going to say an object is extrude feature. What does that really mean? Well, essentially what this means is that extrude feature lives inside of Fusion 360. So if we go back to if we go into Fusion, we have this extrude feature. Well, now this extrude feature to us is just a button right available to us as soon as we open Fusion 360. But to the API, what that extrude feature really means is that you need to be in a design, so a new document, you need to be in that document, and the document is inside of the application of Fusion 360. So we already have these two levels. So if we go back to Visual Studio and we start to think about this structure, this object-oriented structure, first we have the application. Now the application in this case is Fusion 360. All right. So then the application owns the user interface. So then we've got the UI. Now from the UI, we then have to decide things like, are we inside of a design? So I'm going to put design question. And then there are certain tools that are not available if you're outside of the design workspace, for example. If you're in rendering or animation or simulation or wherever, then these tools are not available in the same way. So if you're in a design, okay, well then if you're in a design, is it a solid? Are you on the solid tools? And from there, then you can get to your extrude feature. Now, this is not in any way a direct line between these two. There is a list, and I'll put a link to this as well. And this object model list that you can find will let you know exactly where things live. So the features have things like box feature, hole feature, extrude feature, and so on. And those features belong to a component. Now, in most cases, that component will be the root level. So if you just start a new design and you don't make a new component, but if you do happen to make a new component, well, then we need to take ownership of these features and we need to put them under that new component. Those components belong in the design belongs in the document, and the document belongs to the application. So this object-oriented programming, or this object ownership, the hierarchy, is the base concept for how you access these different tools. So when we're looking at things like creating a program that creates an extrude, we have to think about all the different steps of the puzzle that we would go through in order to make that extrude. So first, we would think about making a sketch, and then the sketch would own things like the sketch line. And all the sketch lines together would create a profile. And you need all of that in place before you can extrude. And all of those sketch elements belong to the component. The component belongs to the UI or the program, and so on and so on. So that concept is the key to being able to navigate the API in Fusion 360. But that's not the only concept. Unfortunately, there's a bit more to it. So it's going to take us a little bit of work to get there. So please, if this is something that you want to learn, I strongly urge you to stick with this video as your starting point if you don't have any experience or knowledge in Python or any experience or knowledge in object-oriented programming. So we've already kind of discussed what an object is, and the example is the extrude feature. And then we kind of talked about the hierarchy or the ownership, the parent-child relationship, and how that works, where we need a sketch profile that belongs to a sketch, that belongs to a component, that belongs to the design, before we can actually even create an extrude. And that's the mindset that you're going to need when you start to think about programming to create these new features and these new items. You're going to have to think about all those steps, and you're going to have to look at that hierarchy to make sure you understand it. So from there, the next important topic is really going to be classes. Now, classes are important, and not so much because we're going to be creating classes in our example, but they are going to be important because we need to understand how they work in order to understand how to access these different tools. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go through a basic example of setting up a class. Now, once we go through the process of setting up the class, it'll start to be a little bit more apparent, but you're going to have to bear with me for a little bit until we get some information out there, and then we're going to talk about it. So first, I'm going to start typing class. Now, again, class is one of those key things in Python. You'll notice that the icon is very different than anything else. So this class, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be defining it. And in my example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just call it lead. And then I need to put colons afterwards. When we define it as lead, what I mean is learn everything about design. What we're going to do is we're going to assume that this class is my YouTube channel. And from there, everything inside the class will be different playlists or series. So when we hit enter, you'll notice that in Python, the tab or the indentation is important. Anything that's tabbed in at this level will be directly inside of this class. In other programming languages, if you're used to doing something in Arduino, you might enclose things in brackets, for example. Well, in Python, it's going to be important that we have our tab structure. For right now, what I'm going to just say is pass, which is telling it that we're skipping this for right now. We're going to come back and define it in a second, but we need to understand the next topic. So once we have a class, what does that really mean? Well, again, the classes are groups of data, and data we call attributes, and they're groups of functions or methods. Now, our class is going to be a grouping of different playlists or series on my YouTube channel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start defining something, a variable like we did above. So I'm going to call this API series. And again, this doesn't exist. This is a new variable we're creating. So then we need to type in that this API series is part of lead. And I need to use these brackets because it's going to be important in a minute, but we're going to use these brackets because they're going to pull data out of this class. I'm only going to use the API series as an example for now. We're not going to fill anything else in, but I also want to just type in forms series, and I'm going to define that the same way. And this is going to be apparent that we now have one video series and we have two video series. Well, what's inside of a video series? Well, right now, nothing. There's nothing inside of that. We haven't defined anything. And just like up here when we did print, you'll notice that we can print multiple things. We had to concatenate them, but it's expecting multiple things to come inside of that function. Well, we haven't defined what those multiple things are in our class, so it doesn't really know what to expect. But we can still define it. So for example, if I say API series dot or period first, and first is just something I made up, I'm going to say equals, and I'm going to make a string intro to API. I'm going to go down to the next line, and I'm going to say API series dot second. This is maybe the second video, and this one is going to be returning a user param. So again, all we did was we defined these strings. Now, if we want to print this out, I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to put a comment out for that. And I say print API series. I need to use the period and first. I need to tell it exactly what I want to print out. I'm going to repeat this process. I'm going to say API series, and again, it can autofill, so you can hit tab, and I'm going to do dot second. So now I'm going to print the first and second. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to run it. So down here, you'll note that it's telling us that API series is not defined. So it's telling us that it's not defined. It doesn't know what this means, and that's because I made a typo here. So I added an extra R. Let's go ahead and fix that, save it, and play it. So now when we take a look at this, you can see that we've returned, and let's go ahead and roll this up a little bit. What we did was we returned intro to API and return a user parameter. So this took a little bit more work, and what we did essentially was we created our own variables. We created this API series variable, which is part of this class lead, and we said that API series dot first is this string. API series dot second is this string. So what happens if you want to streamline this a little bit? Well, then let's go ahead and comment these out. So I'm just going to put the pound sign in front of them, and I'm going to comment out the pass, because now what I want to do is I want to start defining things that are in this class. There's going to be a little bit here that is not going to make much sense, but let's just follow along and let's talk about it. So I'm going to do def, I'm going to define, and then I need to start typing underscores. Then I want to find init. Now this is a Python command. This init is basically initializing the lead class. And you'll notice that it starts with self. So when we do this, what self means is that if we do API series inside of this lead and we pass something, the first expression is it's expecting is itself. And that means that when we do something like API.first, self is that first thing. So API series lead, the first thing is self, and we don't actually have to type it. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put a comma, and we're going to say first, comma, second. So now what it's expecting is it's expecting us to pass itself, which is the first thing, and then two additional things, first and second. I'm going to get rid of this none because we're not going to pass this. And I'm going to get rid of this pass, and I'm going to define what's happening inside of here. So inside of here, we're going to say self, because again, this is passing itself, dot first, and we're just going to say equals first. And then we're going to go down self dot second equals second. Now, I will say that these two things don't need to be the same, but these two things need to be the same. This first and this second, these need to be the same. So this dot first and this dot second is what we typed right here, dot first and dot second. So now what it's expecting is that inside of lead, I'm going to pass it two things. So I'm going to say intro to API. I'm going to put a comma because that's what we have between first and second. And the second one, I'm going to say return a, and if I could spell, return a user param. So now it's getting its first and second. Now I'm going to come back and fill in the form series. And I'm going to say intro to forms, comma. And again, we're passing strings, so they need to be inside single or double quotes. Then I'm going to say use a blueprint. So now what we've done is we've defined API series and form series as part of the class lead, learn everything about design. And inside of the class, we've said, hey, anytime you're calling this class, what you're actually doing is you're passing first and second. And we didn't really give it much instruction about what those things were, but we know that what we're doing is we're passing the first video in a playlist and the second video in a playlist. So now, if we come down here and we print out, let's say, print, I'm going to do forms series dot first, and I'm going to do a plus. I'm going to do a string with just a space in it, and then I'm going to do another plus, and I'm going to do forms series dot second. We'll see if that works and lets us concatenate that. So we'll save it and let's run it. So when we run it, let's check the terminal. Let's go all the way down, and you can see here that we've got intro to API and return a user param. Then we have intro to forms and use a blueprint. Now inside of the use a blueprint, it looks like one word because inside of our code, I didn't really say anything inside of here. So what I could do is I could say, well, let's pass some horizontal lines, some dashes. And then if we replay this, what we're going to end up getting is now we get those dashes between it instead of just a space. So this is the main concept that I think is really important to understand. And oftentimes it's really hard for somebody getting started when they're just learning coding and API at the same time. So let's do a quick review and then we're going to end this video since we're already past 30 minutes here. So at the very start, we learned to create a variable and we learned to store a string in it and a number. We then learned to print that out inside of our terminal. Now, when we get into Fusion 360, we'll talk about how this is different. We're going to use the UI to put message boxes up. But for right now, we're printing to the terminal, which is letting us know that our code worked. We learned that there are different types of variables and that we can't really combine strings and, in this case, I'm just going to say numbers or integers. We know that we have to do some conversion to make those different variables, those different values, match what it's expecting. So in the case of our string and our number, we had to turn our number into a string. Then we learned about Fusion and the fact that it's object-oriented. It's object-oriented programming, or OOP. An object is something like a tool, extrude feature. But there is a hierarchy of ownership that we need to follow in order to access it. So things like the application, Fusion's program itself, the user interface in some cases, depending on what we're accessing, the design workspace, the root component, the solid body that we're attaching it to in some cases, a sketch and a sketch profile. There are all these different things that we need to consider when we're talking about the chain of ownership of each of these objects. And then it's important that we understand classes and how classes are going to require information and how they work. So our basic class was called Lead, Learn Everything About Design. And inside of it, the definition of that was this initialize, init, and this is one of these sort of like key functions inside of Python. And inside of that, we passed self, and then we told it we were looking for first and second. And then we said self.first is equal to first, and self.second is equal to second. So this is giving it instruction on what happens when somebody defines API series as being equal to this class. Then we learned that we can print it out just like we could anything else, this API series.first and API series.second. So why is all of this important is going to start to make sense when we get into creating a script in Fusion 360. But I strongly recommend that if you're interested in learning Python for any other reason, or actually it's just in general, if you're looking to progress with this functionality in Fusion or just Python in general, check out the videos or the links in the description for other YouTube channels that I found were really helpful. They were really clear, they were well planned out, and you can follow along. The ones from Mosh are quite a bit slower. They cover the basics, and it just takes a little bit of time, but he does stop and has little practices along the way, and I think that's very helpful. He does have a free I think it's a 6-hour series. I haven't looked at it, but if it's anything like his 1-hour video, I think that'll be pretty good. And then the other one from Corey Schafer, he does a really good job of getting to the point and explaining things very clearly. Now, he is a programmer by trade, and if you watch his video on object-oriented programming or some of them, he will give you a lot more information about how this stuff works, more functions that you can use, what some of this means. There's a lot more about object inheritance and classes and methods and so on. And we're just sort of scratching the surface to make sure that we understand the basics, and that'll help us understand how to apply it to Fusion. So if you have any questions, obviously you can email me or leave a comment in the video. But at this point, I do have several other videos planned to cover these topics. But this is the one that I really wanted to get out and make sure that we at least had a basic knowledge of just these core topics that are going to be important to us. So from here, I appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.